Our last speaker before tea time is Dr. Emily Grossman, a science communicator and STEM ambassador. Now, Emily is an internationally acclaimed science author, public speaker, and TV personality. She's an expert in molecular biology and genetics, which is where the biology comes in. And she has a double first in natural sciences from Queen's College, Cambridge, and a PhD in cancer research. She's also trained and worked as an actress and a singer, and also as a maths and science teacher. So if that's not multitasking, I don't know what is. She now combines her skills, all of those things together, as a science broadcaster, writer, educator, and trainer. And she was recently named as an honorary STEM ambassador, along with Tim Peake, the astronaut, for her pioneering work in science, technology, education, and medicine education, and as a role model to young people. So thank you very much, Emily.
Good afternoon, everyone. So what I'd like to share with you this afternoon is, for me, what I feel are some of the things that can really support and encourage young people to get into STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, particularly science, that's my thing, but also some of the barriers that there can be, some of the challenges that there can be, whether that's to do with barriers for young women versus young girls versus boys, or whether it's just in terms of diversity, getting different types of people into science. And as Athene's been talking to us about this morning, about how to help and encourage people to stay in those careers. And I'm going to share this with using myself, my own career, my own experiences as an example, because this is one of the things that I do as a STEM ambassador, is when I go into schools, primary schools, secondary schools, universities as well, and talk to young people, I share my experiences as a woman in science and what I've found challenging and what I've found inspiring, and with an aim to kind of hoping to alleviate, to bust through stereotypes and to share with young people somebody else who might be experiencing things similar to them. So for myself, I guess one of the key things that sort of started off my love of science and my inspiration was role models. Now, I know there's controversial evidence as to what role models can actually do for young people, but for me it was very clear, because I grew up with a really inquiring mind, a really inquisitive mind. From the age of about 5, all I can remember doing is asking questions. I was constantly asking why, how come. You know, I used to drive everyone completely mad, my parents, my teachers, but luckily they were really supportive. And in fact, my biggest role model at a young age was actually my dad. Now, my parents divorced when I was quite young, so I didn't get to see my dad so often. But when I did see him, we used to go, I don't know why, but we used to go on these long car journeys. I always remember sitting in the car with my dad. And now I should say my dad is a scientist. He's a medical scientist, he's a doctor, he's a sort of world-renowned researcher himself. But I didn't know that at the age of 5, he was just my dad. And I remember him telling me these really cool stories. Now, we would have what he called theory afternoons. Now, at the age of 5, I didn't know what a theory was. I just knew that he was going to tell me cool stories about the world. So I used to love it. And I remember particularly one time, I remember him telling me that we all used to be monkeys. And at the age of 5, I'm like, this is a crazy concept. You know, I used to be a monkey. He's like, well, not quite you. You know, your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were the same as that of a monkey. And I thought, this is amazing. And to me, this was just a bit of fun. But then later on in school, I mean, I believed him. Later on in school, of course, I learned that this was the theory of evolution. And that's when I started to sort of put it into context. And in another time, I remember him telling me that if I was to travel really, really fast in a spaceship, time would slow down. And again, at the age of 5, I'm like, this is an amazing idea, an amazing, mind-blowing concept. And it wasn't until many years later, when I was studying A-level physics at school, that I sort of clicked that this, of course, was the theory of relativity. And my favourite story, though, that my dad told me was that one time he told me that he's colourblind, and that I'm not. And I was like, okay, well, he told me all about it. He explained what it meant, about how he sees colours, and I thought it was really interesting. And I was like, well, it's not strange that I'm not, because, you know, you're a man, I'm a little girl, there's big differences between us. And he was like, yeah, but what's really interesting is that your kids, one day, if you have them, might be. And I was like, what, you mean there's something that you've got, that you've somehow given to me, that's hiding inside me somewhere, that I don't have as a person? I'm not colourblind, but I could give it to my children? And of course, later on in school, I learned that these like sneaky things that I was fascinated in that were hiding away inside of me were, of course, genes, and he was talking about the theory of inheritance. Now, I share this because this is my earliest memory of anything to do with what I now know is science. But I didn't know it was science, it was just stories. It was just somebody in my life who was interested and excited about the world and about talking about the world. And I didn't know it as anything different other than just fun stories. Now, Athene also mentioned that role models don't have to be female. My role model at that age certainly was my dad, he still is. And he was a man, but that didn't make any difference because he believed in me and he inspired me. And I should say also, my mum was a great role model. She's a writer, she was a TV presenter and very creative. So, you know, I was very lucky that I had these people in my lives to support me. Now, Athene also mentioned about schooling and about single-sex versus mixed-sex education. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware that in nearly half of all mixed-sex state sixth forms, there's not a single girl studying physics. That's quite a big thing. Now, I went to an all-girls school. So, and again, I really smiled when Athene said, you know, anecdotally, so many successful, particularly physicists, not necessarily just scientists, but particularly physicists, professors of physics, many of them anecdotally, women went to single-sex schools. Now, I'm not saying single-sex schools are better, I'm absolutely not. But I'm saying that until I got to the age of 18, I went all the way through my schooling with very supportive parents, with very inspiring role models as my teachers. I had 2 female physics teachers studying physics A-level. I had a female maths teacher. And I didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary for a girl to want to be a scientist. In fact, to want to be a physicist. It just seemed completely normal to me. It didn't occur to me. Now, I didn't have such an easy time at school. You know, it was challenging. I did get kind of isolated sometimes and picked on for kind of being clever, for wanting to study, for wanting to learn. So it wasn't always that easy. But I certainly didn't think on any level that I couldn't be a scientist. Now, it never really occurred to me why that was. What it was about that single-sex environment that just made it not even occur to me. But as a teacher, I've worked with young people a lot. And I've heard many tales of girls who go from single-sex environments into mixed sixth forms. And when they're studying science, they say they sit at the back of their class and they're too scared to put their hands up in case they get it wrong and they get laughed at. Now, I hadn't experienced that. So I went off to Cambridge to do a degree in natural sciences with my intention was to be a physicist. Not many people know that about me because I'm a biologist. But my intention was to be a physicist. Now, what happened? Well, when I got to university, I realised, possibly naively, because it just hadn't occurred to me, that I was one of the only girls studying physics. And I was pretty much, I was really in a minority. There was predominantly male colleagues, male peers, male heads of department, male lecturers, blah, 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 blah. Now, my first thought was, way, finally, you know, I get to study with some boys, I get to have like a social life in my work as well as outside of school, great. And I wasn't intimidated by this. I thought, great, you know, I'm tough and strong, because that's how I saw it at the time in order to be like the boys. But very quickly, I started to lose my confidence. And what happened? Well, I remember very clearly sitting in one of my supervisions in the sort of small tutor groups, and I just couldn't get my head around it. I just couldn't get my head around some of the physics. And I looked around, and all the boys were sort of laughing and joking, and they just seemed so confident, and they seemed to know what they were doing. And I started to feel, if I asked any more questions, because I was always asking questions, I started to feel that they were kind of starting to roll their eyes. Or they were starting to laugh at me and go, oh, God, or laugh when I couldn't understand something or got it wrong. And I used to come out of those supervisions in tears. And I started to think, you know, I'm just not good enough. I'm simply not good enough. I haven't got what it takes to be a physicist anymore. I've come to the top of my intellectual ability, and I just can't carry on. Now, I didn't know what everyone today has been talking about getting mentors, role models, people to talk to. I simply thought, well, I've been independent all my life, I've been fine up till now, I'm just simply not good enough anymore. I didn't share this with anyone, I didn't talk to anyone, and I simply decided that I was going to drop physics. Now, the irony being, I still had to take the physics exams at the end of the first year, even though I'd decided I was going to drop and I was going to switch to biology from second year onwards. So I sat those exams. I came out in tears thinking that I'd failed and made a complete mess of it. And the boys all came out laughing and joking, going, oh, what, you wrote 52? Don't be ridiculous. It was 512. Duh, you're so stupid, whatever. Now, I really want to emphasize that I am not having a dig at guys here at all. I'm having, not a dig, but I am exposing that different people have different learning environments that suit them better. And there are a lot of people who would learn better in a sort of competitive, macho, sink or swim environment that I found myself in, including a lot of girls. Truth, this isn't a gender thing necessarily, but it didn't suit me. I was suited to an environment where I got support, where I got nurtured, where I could ask lots of questions, and that was okay. Anyway, back to the story. I came out of the exams in tears. The boys all came out laughing. I thought, great, it's fine. I've switched. I've dropped this. I never have to do it again. Guess what happened when the results came out? I did better than most of the boys. Now, I'm not telling you this to show off and say, hey, look at me, I'm so good at physics, at all. I'm telling you this because what happened? What happened was that my perception of my abilities changed, not my actual abilities. But because of the environment I was in, I let that perception, that wrong perception, put me off completing my career that I'd always wanted in physics. And that is why I'm not a physicist. I mean, who knows where I would have ended up, and I don't regret it because I love my life and I love my career. But it's just interesting to look at because it happens to so many young people, boys as well as girls. This isn't necessarily a gender thing. This is what kind of person you are and what kind of environments suit you and how you learn best. Now, I finished my degree in biology, and I love my degree, and I decided to go on to do a PhD. So I decided I wanted to go up to Manchester and do a PhD in cancer research. So I was looking at cell cycle regulation, mitosis in yeast. Now, for the second time in my career, in my academic career anyway, I started again to lose my confidence, and I started to feel out of place. Now, this time, I couldn't attribute it, looking back, not that I knew at the time in either of these situations what had been going on, but at the time, even now looking back, I can't attribute it to being female. This isn't, again, a gender thing, for me anyway. So why did I feel out of place? Why did I feel weird and different? Well, I've always felt a bit weird and different, that's the truth. But the environment I found myself in again, it felt like an environment that didn't suit me. Now, my research laboratory was a fantastically successful research laboratory with some fabulous scientists and researchers in it who I admire to this day. But the working environment did not suit me as a person. I found that I was just... One thing I should say, which I haven't said so far, is that I've always really been into theatre and drama, singing and dancing, doing shows, doing plays, doing musicals. So one thing is that I was constantly rushing off to rehearse for shows and plays, and I think a lot of people just didn't really get that. But secondly, it's that I'm really quite a sensitive, emotional person. And I used to be quite ashamed of this and thought it was something wrong. And finally, 15 years later, I'm starting to claim this as something powerful, as something strong. But at the time, I was constantly bursting into tears if I mucked up my experiments, or feeling worried that I didn't understand what I was doing, afraid to ask questions because it was quite a solitary environment, it was quite a competitive environment. And I started to find myself saying in my own head this phrase that since then I have heard so many times in young people, particularly girls, but not just, is that, oh, maybe I'm just a bit too sensitive, too creative, or too emotional to be a scientist. Even though I love science, even though I was good at it, I got a double first from Cambridge in it, and even though I actually really wanted to be a scientist in some ways, there are many young people today, particularly girls, but not exclusively, who say, I'm good at science, I enjoy science, but it's just not for people like me. That's the most common expression as to why girls don't go into science in the first place, or once they're in it, they don't stick at it. And where does this come from? This comes from stereotypes. This comes from a sort of, whether it's conscious or unconscious bias, as to what kind of person should be a scientist, or could be a scientist, or is welcome in a science laboratory, or can cut it or hack it in this kind of science environment. Now, I want to really emphasize here that science doesn't have to be like that. It just so happened that the research environment I found myself in was one that didn't suit me as a person. There are plenty of research environments that do, as you've heard about some of them today. They don't have to be like that, but I didn't know, as a sensitive, emotional person, forget woman or man, I didn't know that it was important to actually create or look for a working environment that suited me as much as look for the intellectual project that inspired me and stimulated me. But I didn't have anyone to talk to about any of this. So again, I made it mean that I was weird, I was wrong, there was something different about me, and that I just didn't fit into the science world. So I got to the end of my PhD because I was really determined, and I didn't want to quit, and I didn't want to stop, because I was so, this is what I'd always wanted to do. But the moment I finished, the same week as I had my Viva, I found out I'd got a place at drama school. So I left research for considerable time, and I went to drama school. I trained as an actress and as a singer in musical theatre at the Guildford School of Acting down in Surrey, and I then spent the next 8 years working in plays and musicals across London and across the country as a performer. And I loved it, but it still didn't quite fit me, because there was still part of me that felt, oh God, I did love science, but I hadn't quite fitted in, and it sort of, I felt I'd been pushed out somewhat by my own choice at the time. And I also felt I didn't quite fit into the theatre world, because there was something about me that wanted to do science and wanted to solve problems and wasn't quite fulfilled. And I had a great 8 years. And actually what I did is I made my living in between acting jobs. It was a very tough industry, very tough world, very hard to get work, and a lot of rejections and a lot of really difficult stuff to deal with emotionally. But I made my living in between acting jobs as a maths and science teacher. And that's when I started to kind of come back and go, whoa, 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 I love science. I love thinking, I love analysing, I love making sense of things, but more than that, I love helping others to make sense of things. I love putting stuff in really simple terms. And I started to feel really inspired by supporting and helping other young people to feel as inspired by science as I am. Now, all through this time, I still started to feel like I was very much two different people, right? I'd always had sort of Emily the actress by night and Emily the scientist by day, or science teacher at that time. And I was kind of craving or yearning for some time in my life where I might just feel like a fully integrated human being, where I might feel like one person, and that I didn't have to be a square peg in that round hole or a square peg in that round hole and just not really fit in. Now, after 8 years in the acting industry, I decided that it wasn't for me anymore. It'd been amazing, I'd had some great jobs, but I just wasn't getting the jobs that I wanted to get consistently enough, and it wasn't a lifestyle that I was enjoying enough. So I did a very scary thing, which was that I quit the industry. I was doing a bit of tutoring to make some money, and for 2, 3, maybe 4 years, I didn't know what I wanted to do in my life, and I was really unhappy. And I just thought, I'm in my early 30s, I've had 3 different careers, and I just don't know where I'm going or what I want to do. And, maybe I'm just never going to make it, whatever that might mean. Maybe I'm just never going to find a place where I fit in, and who am I going to be in the world? And it was a really difficult time. But I'm really glad I took that time out, because it allowed me to really reflect on my motivation, who I am, what I wanted to do, what my ego wanted versus what my actual kind of soul wanted. And I was asking myself all these really challenging questions. And I was getting help with that as well. And then eventually, an opportunity kind of came along to me. And came along through the BBC. Now, the BBC were running a scheme about 5 years ago. They're still running it now, actually, but their flagship scheme 5 years ago called BBC Expert Women. You might have heard about it. But the idea of this scheme was to boost the representation of women as experts in the media, particularly in the areas that are classically more underrepresented by women, which is science, history, politics, business, economics, you name it, really. Now, this was a brilliant scheme. It was run by the BBC Academy, and they put out this kind of nationwide search for female experts, particularly those in science, and particularly those who enjoyed communicating and talking about science. Now, you'd think, on paper, this was a perfect opportunity for someone with my kind of combinations of skills and passions, but my confidence was through the floor at this point. And it took a concerted effort by my friends, my mum, my family, to really push me to even apply for this scheme. And I really, really believed I'm just not good enough. I've been out of science for too long. I'm too old. I'm just going to make a fool of myself. Anyway, I got a place on the scheme. And the night before the training day, it was just a one-day training, I was sitting there and I was leafing through the biogs that they'd sent me of all the 30 women they'd selected. And I was like, I'm not even going to go. This is just terrifying. Like, these women are amazing. And I pretty much almost didn't go. What I'm trying to say. But I did. I forced myself, I got there. And I went into the room on this training day, and the head of the course spoke to us 30 women, and she said, right, I bet every single one of you women thinks you're the one who shouldn't be here. And we all burst out laughing, all of us, because we all felt it. And I looked around, and we were all kind of like giggling at each other, and I was like, oh my God. And they said, yeah, this is a thing. It's got a name. It's called, as Athene told us, Imposter Syndrome. And everyone's talking about Imposter Syndrome now, but back then, I hadn't heard of it. And I was like, what, this is a thing? This is like a real thing? And they were like, yeah, this is what stops women, and it's not just women, it's men too, but this is what stops people from saying yes, from getting out there, from doing things they love doing, be it doing a science career, or be it being on the telly, whatever it is. It's what stops us. And I was like, whoa, hang on a minute. And they said, yeah, you know what? If we want a woman to talk about science as an expert in the media, we have to phone 6 before 1 will say yes. The other 5 will say, oh, I'm not expert enough. Or, ask my colleague, ask my boss, ask my husband, who all happen to be men. Whereas if they want any expert, they'll phone a man, and he will always say yes, even if it's not his field. I know I'm generalising, but this is what the data shows. And it is a generalisation. And of course, there are a lot of men who really fall prey to imposter syndrome. But the point is that women are not putting themselves forward for opportunities because we all feel we're not good enough, that at any moment we're going to be found out. I feel it all the time. Athene said she feels it. I feel it constantly. Now, what this epiphany moment made me realise is that everyone feels like this. And actually, it's up to me to start putting myself back out there and putting myself forward for things I want to do. So in that moment, I decided, right, okay, I want to be a science communicator. I want to make a career out of it. And I said to them, well, how do I do this as a career? And they were like, well, people don't really do it as a career, go back to your day job. And I was like, but I don't really have a day job, at least not one I love doing. I want to do this. And they were like, well, okay, sort of, don't call us, we'll call you type of thing. Now, no disservice to the BBC, who are fantastic, as are all the media outlets, but, fair play to them. There wasn't really such a thing as a science communicator, certainly not when I was at school, and I didn't know it was a career I could do. But I've spent the last 5 years, along with many other people who are really flying the flag now for putting science out into the public domain, I've spent the last 5 years trying to build up this kind of portfolio career as a science communicator. So what I do now is I do work on the telly and on the radio as a science expert on various TV shows. I write books and articles about science, and I train scientists in communication skills, how to give talks, how to communicate their ideas, and how to give interviews and put across their ideas to the media. Now, this is because I think that science is so important, but it's also important how we communicate about it. But the most important part of the work that I now do is that I now work as a public speaker, and I go into schools and I go into universities and I talk to young people about the exciting stuff about maths and science, cutting-edge science topics, but more importantly, I talk about what it is to be a scientist. Because what I've realised is that so many young people, like I did 15 years ago, either don't go into science in the first place or they drop out of science careers because they feel that it's just not for people like them. Because there is this stereotype, right? That a scientist needs to be cold and unemotional and analytical and logical. Of course we need those skills, of course. Of course we need to problem solve and be confident and analytical, of course. But there is so much space for other qualities when it comes to being a scientist. And I finally kind of really awoke to this when I got bitten quite hard by this, when a couple of years ago I appeared on a debate on Sky News, and I supported women in STEM, women in science, and I said that it's okay for scientists to cry. Now, following that debate, I received a sort of tirade of sexist and misogynistic abuse on social media, on Twitter and on YouTube. And a lot of the comments that I was getting were not just, oh, women are stupid and irrational and shouldn't be scientists and stay out the kitchen and toughen up and blah, 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 which was pretty awful in itself. It wasn't just personal attacks on me, which were there, which were pretty awful in themselves, but there were a lot of people who are conforming to this stereotype that there's no room for emotion in science, that there's no room for sensitivity, for vulnerability, for authenticity, for transparency in science. And so one of the messages that I put out today in my work with young people, and I would love to put out into you guys in the work that you do in your research groups, in your labs, with the young people in your lives, with teenagers in your lives, is that actually science is about all sorts of different qualities. And I came back from this awful trolling and misogyny that I experienced to deliver a TEDx talk, which I called Why Science Needs People Who Cry. And in it, I basically talk about the value of emotion in terms of what I call the 3 C's: compassion, collaboration, and creativity. And about how emotional sensitivity is the root, is the core to opening up access for compassionate, collaborative, and creative scientists. And we all know that science is a creative endeavor. We all know that it's compassionate. It's driven by compassion. It's driven by a desire to change the world, to help the world, to understand the world. It's driven by our feelings. Compassion comes from an ability to be with our feelings, to be open, to be sensitive, to be vulnerable to our own feelings and to the feelings of people around us and the world. Science is a collaborative endeavor. It's about empathy. It's about sharing. It's about helping the world as a group, as a team. And so much of that comes from an ability to be open to our own emotions, because we can't collaborate unless we can empathize, and empathy comes from being able to be sensitive and emotional and open, and yes, to cry if we feel to. And I'm not talking about lack of resilience, that's different. But I'm talking about feeling sensitive and emotional and being able to cry when we want to. And finally, creativity. I mean, of course, we all know how creative science is. What's that got to do with emotion? Well, everything. Because creativity is about being able to oscillate between periods of intense focus and intense relaxation. And we cannot relax, we cannot be fully open, we cannot be fully at peace, in tune with ourselves, unless we allow ourselves to feel, unless we allow ourselves to be open, to be sensitive. We're not all as equally open and sensitive as each other. That's fine. If you're not someone who cries, so what? If you're someone who does, that's okay too. But my message to young people, and my message that I would love to leave you with, is that through my career, through all these various challenges and setbacks and inspirations that I've had throughout my career, I've finally come to realize that as long as you're passionate and excited about understanding the world, then science is for you. No matter what sort of person you are, no matter whether you're male or female, what background you come from, what culture you come from, and especially, not just even if you cry, but especially if you cry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily.